The morning sun cast long shadows across the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, as Commander Sarah Mitchell stepped out of a rental car. At 34 years old, she carried herself with a confidence that came from years of service. But today, she felt different. Today, she was playing a role that went against everything she had worked for. The decision to attend the Strategic Leadership Program under false pretenses hadn't been easy. Admiral Rebecca Torres had approached her 6 months earlier with an unusual request. The Navy was concerned about systemic bias in their advanced training programs, particularly toward women and minorities. They needed someone on the inside, someone who could observe and report back on what really happened when officers thought no one important was watching. Sarah had initially refused. She was a respected destroyer commander with a spotless record and a promising career ahead of her. Why risk everything on what amounted to an undercover operation? But Admiral Torres had been persistent. The Navy was changing slowly but surely, and they needed to understand where the resistance was strongest. They needed someone with Sarah's experience and insight to see what others couldn't. So here she was, her commander's insignia replaced with trainee badges, her service record scrubbed from the class roster. To everyone at the War College, she was Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, a junior officer selected for advanced training through what many would assume was a diversity program. The irony wasn't lost on her that she had to hide her achievements to uncover the truth about how others were treated. As she walked toward the main building, Sarah noticed the looks. Some were curious, others skeptical. A few seemed openly dismissive. She had expected this, but experiencing it firsthand was different. She was used to respect, to having her expertise acknowledged. Now she was just another trainee, and apparently one who didn't belong. The registration process was smooth, but telling. The clerk who processed her paperwork was professionally courteous, but noticeably less enthusiastic than she had been with the male officers ahead of Sarah in line. Small things, subtle things, but Sarah's trained, I caught them all. She made mental notes, already building the report that Admiral Torres would eventually read. Her dormitory assignment placed her in a wing predominantly occupied by junior officers. Her roommate, Lieutenant Jennifer Walsh, was a bright young woman from the submarine force who seemed genuinely excited to be there. As they unpacked, Jennifer chatted about her expectations for the program and her hopes of eventually commanding her own vessel. "I heard the instructors here are tough," Jennifer said, hanging up her dress uniforms. "My commanding officer warned me that they don't go easy on anyone, especially women. He said I'd have to prove myself twice as hard as the men." Sarah nodded, making another mental note. "Did he give you any specific advice?" "Keep my head down, work harder than everyone else, and don't give them any reason to doubt I belong here." Jennifer paused, looking uncertain. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm really ready for this level of training. The other officers in my class all seem so much more experienced." "Experience comes in many forms," Sarah replied carefully. "Sometimes the best leaders are the ones who have to work hardest to get where they are." The first formal gathering was a welcome dinner in the officers' club. Sarah dressed carefully, choosing her service dress uniform and ensuring every detail was perfect. As she entered the dining room, she again felt the weight of scrutiny. Conversations seemed to pause as she passed, resuming in quieter tones after she moved on. She was seated at a table with 7 other officers, all male, all senior to her apparent rank. The introductions were polite, but cool. Major Robert Kane from the Marines was particularly dismissive, barely acknowledging her presence before turning to discuss deployment experiences with the others. Captain David Hoffman from the Air Force was more subtle in his skepticism, asking pointed questions about her qualifications that he didn't pose to the male officers. "So, Lieutenant Mitchell," Captain Hoffman said during the salad course, "what brings you to the Strategic Leadership Program? It's quite an opportunity for someone at your level." The question was loaded, and Sarah knew it. She had prepared for this moment, crafting a background that was truthful but incomplete. "I've been fortunate to serve under some excellent commanders who saw potential in me. My current CO recommended me for the program." "And what's your specialty?" Major Kane asked, his tone suggesting he was humoring her. "Surface warfare," Sarah replied simply. "Ah," Kane said with a knowing nod to the others. "Well, I'm sure you'll learn a lot here. The strategic level is quite different from, well, whatever you're used to." Sarah felt her jaw tighten, but maintained her composure. Around the table, she noticed the subtle exchanges of glances, the barely concealed smirks. These men had decided she didn't belong before she'd said a word. They saw her rank and gender and made assumptions about her capabilities and how she'd earned her place in the program. After dinner, there was an informal reception where officers mingled and began forming the relationships that would define their year together. Sarah found herself gravitating toward the small number of other women in the program, not by choice but by circumstance. The men had naturally clustered together, sharing war stories and comparing experiences in a way that subtly excluded the female officers. Lieutenant Commander Patricia Hayes, a logistics officer with 15 years of service, approached Sarah with a knowing smile. "First time in an environment like this?" she asked. "Is it that obvious?" Sarah replied. "The deer in headlights look tends to give it away. Don't worry, you'll find your footing. The key is to be twice as prepared as anyone else and to never let them see you sweat." Patricia lowered her voice. "Word of advice. Some of these guys have already decided we don't belong here. Don't give them the satisfaction of being right." As the evening wound down, Sarah reflected on the interactions she'd observed and experienced. The bias was there, sometimes subtle, sometimes blatant, but always present. Officers who should have known better made assumptions based on appearance rather than merit. Conversations shifted when women joined them. Questions were asked of female officers that male officers never faced. But perhaps most telling was what she didn't see. Any recognition of the possibility that the women in the program might be as qualified or experienced as their male counterparts. The assumption seemed to be that they were there to fill quotas rather than to contribute expertise. Back in her room, Sarah began documenting her observations. She wrote carefully, objectively, noting specific incidents and conversations. This was just the beginning, but already she could see patterns emerging that would concern Admiral Torres and the other senior leaders who had authorized this unusual mission. Jennifer returned from a phone call with her family, looking slightly overwhelmed. "My brother's at the Air Force Academy," she said. "He asked if I thought I was really ready for this level of training, or if I was just there because they needed more women." "What did you tell him?" Sarah asked. "That I wouldn't be here if I hadn't earned it," Jennifer replied firmly. "But honestly, after tonight, I'm starting to wonder if anyone else believes that." Sarah wanted to reassure her young roommate, to tell her that her qualifications spoke for themselves, but she had to maintain her cover. Instead, she offered the kind of support a fellow lieutenant might provide. "The only opinion that matters is your own. Don't let anyone else define your worth." As she settled in for the night, Sarah thought about the weight of what she was doing. She was here to expose bias and discrimination, but in doing so, she was experiencing it firsthand. Every dismissive comment, every patronizing question, every assumption about her capabilities was both data for her report and a personal affront to everything she had achieved. But she also understood something that Admiral Torres might not have fully grasped when she assigned this mission. The bias wasn't just affecting how others perceive female officers. It was affecting how those officers perceive themselves. Jennifer's self-doubt wasn't entirely unfounded. It was a rational response to an environment that constantly questioned her right to be there. Tomorrow would bring their first classes, the real beginning of the strategic leadership program. Sarah knew the challenges would only intensify as the program progressed. She would have to excel academically while hiding her true experience and knowledge. She would have to navigate the social dynamics of a group that had already decided she didn't belong while gathering the evidence that Admiral Torres needed. Most importantly, she would have to maintain the delicate balance between her mission and her integrity. She was here to help the Navy become better, but she was doing so by deceiving people who might actually benefit from knowing the truth about her background and experience. As she drifted off to sleep, Sarah wondered how long she could maintain the charade and what the ultimate cost would be. She was about to find out that some secrets are harder to keep than others, and that the truth has a way of emerging when you least expect it. The stage was set for a year that would challenge everything she thought she knew about leadership, integrity, and the price of progress. In trying to expose the Navy's blind spots, she was about to discover a few of her own. The first week of classes at the Naval War College proved to be everything Sarah had expected and worse. The academic rigor was substantial, but manageable for someone with her experience. The real challenge lay in restraining herself from demonstrating knowledge that a lieutenant shouldn't possess while still performing well enough to avoid drawing negative attention. Professor James Morrison's strategic planning course was particularly difficult to navigate. Morrison was a retired Rear Admiral with decades of experience, and his case studies often drew from scenarios Sarah had actually encountered during her command tours. When he presented the hypothetical crisis in the South China Sea, Sarah recognized it immediately as a modified version of an incident she had personally managed 2 years earlier. The class discussion that followed was painful to watch. Several officers offered solutions that Sarah knew from experience wouldn't work based on flawed assumptions about Chinese naval capabilities and intentions. Major Kane, who had emerged as an informal leader among the male officers, proposed a response that Sarah knew would escalate rather than resolve the crisis. The key is to show strength immediately, Kane argued confidently. Move carrier assets into the disputed zone and make it clear we won't back down. The Chinese respect force. They'll fold if we demonstrate resolve. Sarah bit her tongue as other officers nodded in agreement. She had witnessed firsthand what happened when military leaders confused posturing with strategy. The real solution required patience, precise coordination with allied forces, and a deep understanding of Chinese face-saving measures that allowed de-escalation without apparent capitulation. When Professor Morrison asked for other perspectives, Sarah found herself in an impossible position. She could offer a correct analysis that might seem too sophisticated for her apparent rank, or remain silent, and watch her classmates embrace a dangerous strategy. She chose a middle path. I wonder if we might be overlooking diplomatic channels, she said carefully. Sometimes what looks like weakness to us might actually be the kind of strategic patience that prevents larger conflicts. Kane turned to her with barely concealed condescension. That's a very theoretical perspective, Lieutenant. But when you're dealing with real threats, you need real solutions. Academic theories don't stop missiles. The irony was staggering. Kane was lecturing her about real-world military experience while proposing a strategy that could start a war. But Sarah couldn't defend her position without revealing knowledge she wasn't supposed to have. She nodded politely and made another note for her growing report. Professor Morrison, however, seemed intrigued by her comment. Interesting point, Lieutenant Mitchell. Can you elaborate on what specific diplomatic approaches might be effective in this scenario? Sarah felt the attention of the entire class focus on her. She could provide a detailed analysis based on actual negotiations she had been part of, or she could deflect and maintain her cover. I'm not sure I have enough experience to say, she replied, hating every word. I was just thinking about some of the historical examples we've studied. Morrison's expression suggested he wasn't entirely satisfied with her response, but he moved on. Sarah caught him looking at her thoughtfully several times during the remainder of the class. The pattern continued throughout the week. In Captain Elizabeth Warren's leadership theory course, Sarah listened to oversimplified explanations of concepts she had been applying for years. When Lieutenant Commander Hayes offered an insightful analysis of transformational leadership, Kane dismissed it as textbook theory from someone who's never had to make life-or-death decisions. Sarah knew that Hayes had commanded a supply convoy through hostile territory in Afghanistan, but apparently her logistics background made her combat experience invisible to officers like Kane. The gender dynamics were becoming increasingly clear and increasingly frustrating. The social challenges were as difficult as the academic ones. Study groups formed naturally along social lines, and Sarah found herself excluded from the most influential gatherings. When she did manage to join discussions, her contributions were often met with polite dismissal or explained back to her by male officers who assumed she hadn't understood her own points. The breaking point came during a group exercise in Professor Morrison's class. The assignment was to develop a strategic response to a complex humanitarian crisis in West Africa, complete with military, diplomatic, and economic components. The class was divided into teams of 6, and Sarah found herself grouped with Kane, Captain Hoffman, 2 other male officers, and Lieutenant Walsh. From the beginning, Kane assumed leadership of the group without discussion. He delegated tasks based on what he apparently considered each member's natural abilities. Sarah and Jennifer were assigned to research humanitarian aid protocols while the men handled military strategy and diplomatic planning. Let's be practical about this, Kane explained with the patronizing tone Sarah was beginning to hate. You ladies understand the humanitarian angle better than we do. Women have a natural empathy for that kind of work. Sarah wanted to point out that she had actually coordinated humanitarian missions and that her natural empathy came from extensive training and experience, not her gender. Instead, she accepted the assignment and began working on what should have been a straightforward research task. But as she delved into the scenario details, Sarah realized that the group was missing crucial elements that would doom their strategy to failure. The humanitarian crisis was secondary to a larger regional conflict involving multiple state and non-state actors. The military response Kane was planning addressed symptoms rather than causes, and the diplomatic approach Hoffman was developing ignored key regional power dynamics. She tried to raise these concerns during their planning sessions, but her input was consistently marginalized. When she suggested that the humanitarian crisis might be intentionally orchestrated to draw international forces into a larger conflict, Kane smiled indulgently. That's an interesting theory, Lieutenant, but let's stick to the facts in the scenario. We can't start inventing complications that aren't there. The complications were there, embedded in the details that Kane hadn't bothered to read carefully. Sarah had spotted them because she had experience recognizing the patterns of proxy conflicts and manufactured crises. But explaining her reasoning would require admitting to knowledge and analytical skills that didn't match her supposed background. Jennifer, meanwhile, was struggling with her own frustrations. Despite her submarine expertise, she was being treated as a clerical assistant rather than a strategic thinker. When she suggested modifications to the military approach based on her understanding of logistics and supply chains, the male officers thanked her for her input and then ignored her recommendations. Maybe we should listen to what she's saying, Sarah suggested, trying to support her roommate. Submarine operations require incredibly precise logistics planning. Her perspective might be valuable. I'm sure Lieutenant Walsh has valuable insights, Captain Hoffman replied diplomatically, but we need to focus on the big picture rather than getting bogged down in operational details. The dismissal was polite, but absolute. Sarah realized that they weren't really interested in Jennifer's expertise. They were interested in appearing collaborative while maintaining control of all significant decisions. As the project progressed, Sarah watched their strategy take shape and saw disaster looming. The humanitarian mission would succeed initially, but collapse when the underlying conflict erupted. The military forces would be caught off guard and under-equipped for the broader crisis they would face. The diplomatic initiatives would fail because they were based on misunderstanding the motivations and relationships of the key players. She could fix it. She could guide them toward a strategy that would actually work. But doing so would require demonstrating analytical capabilities and strategic knowledge that a junior lieutenant shouldn't possess. She was trapped between her mission to observe and her instinct to prevent a potentially catastrophic military strategy, even in a classroom exercise. The night before their presentation, Sarah made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of the program. She drafted a memo outlining the flaws in their approach and the adjustments needed to address the real strategic challenges in the scenario. She provided detailed analysis of the regional players, their motivations, and their likely responses to various interventions. She offered solutions that were both militarily sound and politically feasible. Then, she deleted it. Instead, she submitted the group's flawed strategy and watched them present a plan that would fail spectacularly in the real world. Professor Morrison's critique was devastating but fair. He systematically dismantled their assumptions, pointed out the strategic blind spots, and explained how their approach would likely escalate rather than resolve the crisis. Kane was visibly shaken by the criticism. Captain Hoffman became defensive, arguing that they had addressed all the elements in the scenario. But Morrison was relentless in his analysis, demonstrating a level of strategic thinking that Sarah recognized from her own experience at the highest levels of military planning. After the presentation, As the group gathered to discuss what had gone wrong, Sarah felt like a fraud. She had watched her teammates make preventable mistakes because correcting them would have blown her cover. She had chosen her mission over their learning, and the weight of that decision was heavier than she had anticipated. "I don't understand what we missed," Jennifer said quietly. "I thought we covered everything." "The professor has expectations that are probably unrealistic for our level," Kane replied, his ego clearly bruised. "Some of those insights he wanted us to have would require years of experience we don't have." Sarah almost laughed at the irony. She did have those years of experience, and she had deliberately hidden them. Kane was right that the expectations were high, but wrong about their ability to meet them. With proper collaboration and respect for each team member's expertise, they could have developed a much stronger strategy. That evening, Sarah called Admiral Torres from a secure line in her dormitory. The conversation was brief and cryptic, but she managed to convey her growing concerns about the program's dynamics and her own ethical dilemma. "The patterns you're observing," Admiral Torres said carefully, "are they consistent with what we suspected?" "Yes, ma'am. But there's a complication. The environment is affecting performance in ways that might not be immediately obvious. People are capable of more than they're being allowed to demonstrate." "Continue your observations, Commander. The information you're gathering is valuable." As Sarah hung up, she realized that Admiral Torres had used her real rank. It was a small slip, but it reminded her of who she really was and why this mission mattered. She wasn't just documenting bias. She was experiencing the way it undermined military effectiveness by wasting talent and perpetuating poor decision-making. The weeks ahead would test her resolve in ways she hadn't anticipated. Each day brought new challenges to her cover story and new evidence of the systemic problems Admiral Torres wanted documented. But it also brought increasing awareness of the personal cost of deception, even when undertaken for the best of reasons. Sarah was learning that truth and justice don't always align perfectly, and that sometimes the right thing to do isn't immediately clear. She was also discovering that some secrets become heavier the longer they're carried, and that the weight of hidden identity can change the person carrying it. Her mission was succeeding, but success was proving more complicated than anyone had anticipated. The question was whether the ultimate revelation would be worth the price she was paying to gather the evidence that would make change possible. 3 months into the program, Sarah had settled into an uncomfortable routine of academic excellence, tempered by deliberate restraint. Her careful balance was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain as the coursework grew more sophisticated and her classmates' assumptions about her capabilities became more entrenched. The crisis that would ultimately expose her true identity began with what seemed like a routine emergency drill. Admiral Michael Stevens, the War College Commandant, announced during morning formation that the college would be participating in a large-scale simulation exercise with the Pentagon. A genuine international crisis had emerged in the Persian Gulf, and senior leadership wanted the advanced students to provide independent strategic assessments. "This is not a drill," Admiral Stevens emphasized. "Your recommendations will be forwarded to the Joint Chiefs for consideration. The situation is developing rapidly, and we need your best strategic thinking." The scenario was complex. Iran had seized 3 commercial vessels in international waters, claiming they were smuggling weapons to regional adversaries. 2 of the vessels were flagged to NATO allies, and 1 carried a mixed crew, including American citizens. Initial diplomatic efforts had failed, and military options were being evaluated while negotiations continued. Sarah felt her pulse quicken as Admiral Stevens outlined the details. This wasn't a classroom exercise. It was a real crisis with real consequences. The strategic assessments they developed could influence actual military operations and potentially affect the lives of the hostages. The students were divided into 3 teams, each tasked with developing comprehensive response strategies. Sarah found herself assigned to Team Alpha, led by Major Kane, and including Captain Hoffman, Lieutenant Commander Hayes, and 3 other senior officers. Her heart sank as she realized she would once again be expected to play a supporting role while watching potentially flawed strategies develop. Kane wasted no time asserting control of the team. We need to move fast and decisively, he announced. Iran is testing our resolve, and if we show any hesitation, they'll see weakness and escalate further. The team gathered in a secure conference room equipped with classified communication systems and real-time intelligence feeds. For the first time since arriving at the War College, Sarah was working with actual operational intelligence rather than historical case studies. The information was current, detailed, and painted a complex picture of regional tensions that extended far beyond the immediate crisis. As Sarah reviewed the intelligence briefs, her experience immediately identified patterns that her teammates were missing. The vessel seizures weren't random acts of aggression. They were carefully coordinated moves in a larger strategic game involving multiple regional powers. The timing, the specific targets, and the Iranian statements all pointed to a more sophisticated strategy than simple provocation. Captain Hoffman was developing what he called a graduated response strategy, beginning with economic sanctions and building toward military action if diplomatic efforts failed. Major Kane favored a more direct approach, arguing for immediate naval deployment to demonstrate American resolve. Lieutenant Commander Hayes focused on the humanitarian aspects, emphasizing the need to prioritize hostage safety. Sarah listened to their discussions with growing frustration. Each officer was bringing valuable perspectives, but they were analyzing the situation in isolation rather than understanding the interconnected nature of the crisis. The vessel seizures were just one element of a coordinated campaign that included cyber attacks on regional infrastructure, diplomatic pressure on American allies, and carefully timed provocations designed to force the United States into an overreaction. When Kane asked for her assessment, Sarah faced the same dilemma that had plagued her throughout the program. She could offer superficial observations that matched her apparent experience level, or she could provide the kind of strategic analysis that the crisis demanded, but that would raise questions about her background. I noticed that the timing of these seizures coincides with several other regional developments, she said carefully. The cyber attacks on Saudi infrastructure, the diplomatic protests from Qatar, the increased naval activity near the Strait of Hormuz. It might be worth considering whether these are coordinated actions rather than separate incidents. Kane dismissed her observation with a wave of his hand. Those are interesting coincidences, Lieutenant, but we need to focus on the immediate crisis. We can't get distracted by every regional development. But Lieutenant Commander Hayes looked intrigued. Actually, Sarah's point is worth exploring. If these actions are coordinated, then our response needs to address the broader strategy, not just the vessel seizures. Patricia, we don't have time for elaborate conspiracy theories, Captain Hoffman interjected. The situation became critical when Admiral Stevens returned with updated intelligence. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard had announced that any American military vessels approaching the seized ships would be considered acts of war. Meanwhile, intelligence sources reported unusual submarine activity in the region and the deployment of advanced missile systems to coastal positions. The Pentagon wants our initial assessments in 2 hours, Admiral Stevens announced. This is your opportunity to contribute to real strategic decision-making. Make it count. As the teams worked frantically to finalize their recommendations, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She couldn't watch her teammates develop a strategy that would endanger lives when she had the knowledge to offer a better alternative. She began writing a detailed strategic assessment that drew on her actual experience managing similar crises. She outlined the complex web of regional relationships that was driving the crisis, identified the key leverage points that could be used to de-escalate the situation, and proposed a coordinated response that addressed Iran's underlying strategic concerns while securing the release of the hostages and detained crews. Her analysis was sophisticated, detailed, and based on intimate knowledge of Iranian decision-making processes, regional power dynamics, and the specific capabilities of American and allied forces in the region. It was also far beyond what a junior lieutenant should have been able to produce. Major Kane was reviewing the team's final recommendations when he noticed Sarah typing furiously on her laptop. "What are you working on, Lieutenant?" "We've already finalized our assessment." Sarah looked up from her screen, realizing she had reached a point of no return. "I think there might be some elements we're missing. I've been putting together some additional analysis." Kane's expression shifted from curiosity to suspicion. Additional analysis? We're not supposed to be working individually. Everything goes through the team. Understand, but I think this information could be important for the overall assessment. Captain Hoffman moved behind Sarah to look at her screen. What he saw made his face go pale. Sarah's document was a comprehensive strategic analysis that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of intelligence assessment, regional politics, and military capabilities. The writing was precise, professional, and exhibited the kind of strategic thinking that came from years of high-level experience. How do you know the specific missile systems Iran has positioned along the coast? Sarah realized that her expertise had betrayed her. In her focus on developing an effective strategy, she had unconsciously incorporated intelligence and insights that weren't available to the students. Her analysis revealed knowledge of Iranian capabilities, American force postures, and regional relationships that only senior officers with appropriate clearances should possess. Major Kane's voice was cold when he spoke. I think we need to have a conversation about exactly who Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell really is. The weight of months of deception crashed down on Sarah as she looked around the room. These officers had treated her poorly based on assumptions about her rank and gender, but she had also deceived them about her true identity and capabilities. The revelation would vindicate her expertise, but destroy the mission Admiral Torres had entrusted to her. I can explain, she began, but Captain Hoffman cut her off. I think explanations can wait until we have proper supervision. Major Kane, I recommend we inform Admiral Stevens immediately. As Kane moved toward the secure phone, Sarah realized that her mission was about to end abruptly and possibly catastrophically. The evidence she had gathered about bias and discrimination would be tainted by the revelation that she had been operating under false pretenses. The officers she had been observing would feel betrayed and manipulated, making any positive change more difficult to achieve. But perhaps most importantly, the strategic crisis in the Persian Gulf was real, and the assessment she had written could contribute to saving lives. The question was whether revealing her true identity would enhance or undermine her ability to influence the response to the crisis. Lieutenant Commander Hayes was still studying Sarah's analysis when she made an observation that would prove crucial. Wait a minute. This assessment, regardless of how she obtained the information, is brilliant. It identifies patterns and connections that our team completely missed. If she's right about the coordinated nature of these actions, then our current strategy could make the situation much worse. Major Kane paused with his hand on the phone. Patricia, we can't just ignore the fact that she's been lying to us about who she is. No, we can't ignore it. But we also can't ignore the possibility that she might be the most qualified person in this room to help solve this crisis. Don't you think we should find out who she really is before we decide what to do about it? Sarah looked around the room at faces that showed confusion, suspicion, betrayal, and grudging respect. In a few moments, Admiral Stevens would arrive, and her cover would be completely blown. The mission would be over, but the crisis would continue. She made a decision that would define the rest of her career and possibly change the trajectory of the entire program. She was going to tell them exactly who she was and trust that the truth, however complicated, would ultimately serve both her mission and the urgent needs of the current crisis. The revelation was about to begin, and nothing would ever be the same. The conference room fell into intense silence as Sarah closed her laptop and looked around at her teammates. Major Kane still had his hand on the secure phone. Captain Hoffman was studying her with new eyes, and Lieutenant Commander Hayes was waiting with barely concealed anticipation. The moment of truth had arrived, and Sarah knew there was no going back. Before you call Admiral Stevens, Sarah said quietly, there are some things you need to know about who I really am and why I'm here. Major Kane's expression hardened. I think Admiral Stevens should hear this explanation along with the rest of us. You're right, Sarah agreed. But the crisis in the Persian Gulf is real, and people's lives are at stake. Whatever you think about me personally, I need you to understand that the assessment I just wrote could help prevent American service members from being killed or captured. Captain Hoffman leaned back in his chair, his analytical mind clearly working through the implications. So, you saying you're not really a lieutenant? No, I'm not. Sarah took a deep breath and made the decision that would change everything. My name is Commander Sarah Mitchell. I've been serving in the Navy for 14 years, the last 3 as commanding officer of USS Fitzgerald. I'm here on a special assignment from Admiral Torres to assess institutional bias in advanced training programs. The silence that followed was deafening. Major Kane slowly lowered his hand from the phone, his face cycling through emotions from shock to anger to something approaching embarrassment. Captain Hoffman's eyes widened as he processed the implications, and Lieutenant Commander Hayes looked like someone had just solved a puzzle she'd been working on for months. You're a destroyer commander? Hayes asked in amazement. Oh, 5 sitting in our classes pretending to be a junior officer? That's correct. Major Kane found his voice, and it was filled with barely controlled fury. You've been lying to us for 3 months. Watching us, judging us, pretending to be someone you're not. Do you have any idea how that feels? Sarah met his gaze steadily. I imagine it feels like being dismissed and underestimated based on assumptions rather than evidence. I imagine it feels like having your expertise ignored because it doesn't match people's preconceptions. The barb hit home, and Kane's face reddened. But before he could respond, Captain Hoffman raised a hand. Wait, let's think about this logically. If Commander Mitchell is here on assignment from Admiral Torres, then this is an authorized operation. The question is whether we should be angry about being observed or embarrassed about what the observation revealed. Lieutenant Commander Hayes was nodding slowly. That explains a lot. The way you asked questions that seemed too sophisticated for a lieutenant. The way you seemed frustrated when we dismissed your suggestions. You weren't just offering theories. You were drawing on actual command experience. And you watched us treat you like you didn't know what you were talking about. Kane said, the anger in his voice now mixed with something else. You let us patronize you and dismiss your expertise. That was the point, Sarah replied. Admiral Torres needed to understand how bias affects the learning environment and decision-making processes in advanced training. She needed someone who could experience it firsthand and document the patterns. Captain Hoffman was studying her with new respect. The strategic assessment you just wrote, that's based on actual experience managing similar crises, isn't it? 2 years ago, Iran conducted a similar provocation during a period of heightened tensions. I was part of the task force that developed the response strategy. The patterns we're seeing now are remarkably similar to what we faced then. And our strategy? Kane asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Would likely escalate the crisis and put American forces at unnecessary risk. Iran is testing our response to see if we'll overreact and provide justification for broader regional actions. A measured response that addresses their underlying concerns while maintaining pressure for hostage release would be more effective. The room fell silent again as the implications sank in. For 3 months, these officers have been working alongside someone with far more experience and expertise than anyone realized. They had dismissed her contributions, patronized her suggestions, and excluded her from significant decision-making based on assumptions about her rank and gender. Major Kane was the first to speak, and his voice was subdued. How many times did we ignore strategic insights that could have improved our work? That's not the point, Sarah said gently. The point is understanding how bias affects military effectiveness. You're all intelligent, capable officers, but the environment encouraged you to make assumptions that prevented you from recognizing and utilizing available expertise. Lieutenant Commander Hayes looked thoughtful. It wasn't just about you, was it? Jennifer Walsh, the other women in the program, probably some of the minority officers too. We've been making assumptions about everyone based on appearance rather than capability. That's exactly what Admiral Torres wanted to understand. Captain Hoffman stood and began pacing, his mind clearly working through the broader implications. This explains the questions Professor Morrison has been asking about group dynamics and decision-making processes. He's been studying our behavior as much as teaching us strategy. Several faculty members are aware of the study, Sarah confirmed. But not all of them. Kane was struggling with the revelation, his worldview clearly shaken. So when I lectured you about real-world military experience, you were lecturing a destroyer commander who has managed actual international crises. And when we assigned you and Jennifer to research humanitarian aid, because women have natural empathy, you were assigning mission-critical analysis to people you assumed were less capable of strategic thinking. The weight of their behavior was clearly settling on the male officers. Captain Hoffman stopped pacing and turned to Sarah. What happens now? Do you report back that we're all biased and recommend that we be removed from the program? That's not my decision to make, Sarah replied. My job was to observe and document patterns. What leadership does with that information is up to them. Lieutenant Commander Hayes leaned forward. But you could recommend that we be given a chance to learn from this experience, to prove that we can change our behavior when we understand the impact. Sarah looked around the room at faces that now showed genuine introspection rather than defensive anger. The question is whether you're willing to examine your assumptions about other officers in the program and adjust your behavior accordingly. What about the current crisis? Captain Hoffman asked. Your assessment could actually help resolve the situation in the Persian Gulf. Don't we have an obligation to contribute that expertise regardless of the personal dynamics? Before Sarah could respond, the secure phone rang. Major Kane answered it, listened briefly, then hung up with a grim expression. Admiral Stevens wants all team leaders in his office immediately. The situation has escalated. Iran has announced that they're moving the hostages to undisclosed locations and that any rescue attempt will result in their execution. The room erupted in tension as the implications hit home. The window for diplomatic resolution was closing rapidly, and military options were becoming increasingly dangerous and complex. Sarah made a decision that would define the rest of her mission. We need to brief Admiral Stevens on all our findings, including the strategic assessment that draws on my actual experience. The personal complications can be sorted out later, but right now people's lives are at stake. Major Kane nodded slowly. You're right. Whatever issues we have with the deception, we can't let that interfere with developing the best possible response to the crisis. But Admiral Stevens is going to want explanations, Captain Hoffman pointed out. We can't just present your assessment without revealing who you really are. Then, we reveal who I really am, Sarah said simply. The mission parameters have changed. This is no longer just about documenting bias. It's about preventing a potential military disaster. Lieutenant Commander Hayes gathered her materials. What do we tell him about the past 3 months? The truth. That an experienced commander has been observing our program and has insights that could help resolve the current crisis. The bias study can be addressed separately. As they prepared to leave for Admiral Stevens' office, Sarah realized that her undercover mission was ending in a way none of them had anticipated. She had set out to document how bias affected military effectiveness, but she was about to demonstrate how revealing hidden expertise could enhance it. The question was whether Admiral Stevens would be more interested in her strategic insights or her deception, and whether her teammates would support her when the full truth came out, or whether the revelation would destroy any possibility of the positive change Admiral Torres had hoped to achieve. Major Kane paused at the door. Commander Mitchell, for what it's worth, your assessment of our strategic blindness was accurate. We did underestimate you, and we did make assumptions that undermined our effectiveness. The important thing now is whether we can use that understanding to do better going forward. And the crisis gets resolved with the best strategic thinking we can provide, regardless of where it comes from or what rank is on someone's uniform. As they walked toward Admiral Stevens' office, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Her secret was out, but the real test was just beginning. The next hour would determine whether her mission had achieved its purpose or whether the revelation would overshadow any positive outcomes. The truth was finally emerging, but truth alone wasn't enough. What mattered was what they did with it. Admiral Michael Stevens sat behind his mahogany desk, his weathered face reflecting the gravity of the crisis unfolding in the Persian Gulf. His office, lined with commendations and photographs from 4 decades of naval service, had witnessed countless strategic discussions, but none quite like what was about to unfold. Gentlemen, Commander Hayes, he began, then paused as he noticed Sarah among the group. I don't believe we've met, Lieutenant. Actually, sir, Major Kane interrupted, his voice steady despite the momentous nature of what he was about to reveal. there's something you need to know about Lieutenant Mitchell before we begin. Admiral Stevens' eyebrows rose slightly. In his experience, emergency briefings that began with revelations about personnel rarely went smoothly. I'm listening, Major. Sarah stepped forward, coming to attention with the bearing that had been ingrained through years of command. Sir, I'm Commander Sarah Mitchell, commanding officer of USS Fitzgerald, operating under special assignment from Admiral Torres to assess institutional dynamics within advanced training programs. The silence that followed was profound. Admiral Stevens studied Sarah with new eyes, his expression shifting from confusion to understanding to something approaching admiration. Commander Mitchell, I should have recognized the name. Your handling of the Taiwan Strait incident earned considerable attention at the Pentagon. Thank you, sir. Stevens leaned back in his chair, processing the implications. Admiral Torres' bias assessment study. I was briefed on the broad parameters, but not the specific methodology. He looked around the room at the other officers. I take it you've all just learned about Commander Mitchell's true identity? Yes, sir, Captain Hoffman replied. Under circumstances that have proven quite illuminating. I imagine they have. Stevens' tone was dry, but not unsympathetic. He turned back to Sarah. And now you're here because the crisis in the Persian Gulf has complicated your mission parameters? That's correct, sir. I prepared a strategic assessment based on my actual experience with similar Iranian provocations. The situation is more complex than initial analysis suggests, and current response strategies may inadvertently escalate rather than resolve the crisis. Admiral Stevens gestured to the conference table. Let's hear what you've developed. As they settled around the table, Sarah opened her laptop and began presenting the analysis that had revealed her true identity. But now, speaking as a commander rather than a lieutenant, her presentation carried an authority and depth that commanded immediate attention. The vessel seizures are part of a coordinated regional strategy designed to test American resolve while providing Iran with multiple escalation and de-escalation options, she began. The pattern is consistent with the provocations we faced in 2023, where initial military responses played into Iranian strategic objectives. She outlined the web of regional relationships, the timing of coordinated actions, and the specific leverage points that could be used to secure hostage release while avoiding broader conflict. Her analysis was comprehensive, sophisticated, and clearly based on intimate knowledge of Iranian decision-making processes and regional power dynamics. Major Kane, who had dismissed her insights just hours earlier, listened with growing respect and visible discomfort. Captain Hoffman took detailed notes, occasionally asking questions that demonstrated his understanding of the strategic complexities involved. Your recommendation? Admiral Stevens asked when she finished. A coordinated response that addresses Iran's underlying concerns about regional security while maintaining pressure for immediate hostage release. This requires diplomatic engagement with key regional players, measured military deployments that demonstrate resolve without triggering escalation, and economic incentives that provide Iran with face-saving options. Stevens was nodding slowly. This aligns with intelligence assessments we've received from the region, but provides much more detailed implementation guidance. He looked around the table. How do the rest of you evaluate Commander Mitchell's analysis? The question hung in the air as Sarah's former teammates grappled with endorsing an assessment from someone they had been dismissing for months. It was Lieutenant Commander Hayes who spoke first. Sir, the analysis addresses critical elements that our initial team assessment missed. If Commander Mitchell's evaluation is correct, our original recommendations could have resulted in unnecessary casualties and strategic failure. Captain Hoffman nodded in agreement. The depth of regional understanding and the specific knowledge of Iranian capabilities suggest that this assessment should be given serious consideration by senior leadership. Major Kane was silent for a moment before speaking. Admiral, I need to be honest about something. For the past 3 months, we've been dismissing strategic insights from Commander Mitchell because we assumed she was a junior officer who couldn't possibly understand complex strategic issues. We were wrong, and our assumptions nearly led us to recommend a dangerous strategy. Admiral Stevens studied Kane with interest. Are you saying that bias affected your team's analytical processes? Yes, sir. Absolutely. And not just regarding Commander Mitchell. We've been making assumptions about capabilities and expertise based on rank, gender, and other factors rather than evaluating contributions on their merits. The admission was painful, but clear, and Sarah felt a complex mixture of vindication and sympathy for her former teammate. Kane was demonstrating the kind of intellectual honesty and professional growth that made real change possible. Admiral Stevens turned back to Sarah. Commander, I assume this bias dynamic was central to your assessment mission? Yes, sir. The patterns we observed here are consistent with systemic issues that may be affecting military effectiveness at multiple levels. And your recommendations for addressing these issues? Sarah had been preparing for this question throughout her mission, but the events of the past few hours had given her insights she hadn't anticipated. Structural changes are necessary, but not sufficient, sir. What's needed is a fundamental shift in how we evaluate expertise and contributions. Officers need to understand that diversity isn't just about fairness. It's about military effectiveness. She gestured to her teammates. These are all capable officers who allowed assumptions to override analytical rigor. But when confronted with evidence of their biases, they were willing to examine their behavior and adjust accordingly. The capacity for change exists. It needs to be fostered systematically. Captain Hoffman leaned forward. Admiral, if I may, the experience of working with Commander Mitchell's actual expertise has been transformative. Knowing that we missed opportunities to benefit from her knowledge has forced us to question our assumptions about other officers as well. Such as Lieutenant Walsh, for one. We've been treating her submarine expertise as irrelevant to strategic planning when it actually provides crucial insights into logistics and operational planning. Some of the minority officers in our cohort probably have perspectives and experiences we've been overlooking. Admiral Stevens was making notes as they spoke. This suggests that the bias issue extends beyond gender to broader assumptions about background and experience. Absolutely, sir. Hayes confirmed. We've been operating with unconscious hierarchies that don't necessarily reflect actual capability or relevant expertise. The secure phone rang, interrupting their discussion. Admiral Stevens answered, listened briefly, then hung up with a grave expression. The Pentagon wants immediate strategic recommendations. The Iranian situation is deteriorating rapidly, and military options are being actively considered. He looked directly at Sarah. Commander Mitchell, I'm forwarding your assessment to the Joint Chiefs with my strongest recommendation. Your analysis may prevent a significant strategic error. Thank you, sir. But I also want to address the broader issues your mission has revealed. Stevens stood and began pacing behind his desk. If bias is affecting analytical processes at this level, it's certainly affecting decision-making throughout the fleet. We need systematic changes to how we evaluate expertise and contributions. Major Kane spoke up. Sir, if I may suggest, the officers in this room have gained insights that could be valuable for training others. We've experienced firsthand how assumptions can undermine effectiveness. An interesting proposal. You're volunteering to help develop training programs around unconscious bias and analytical rigor. Yes, sir. We have an obligation to ensure that other officers don't make the same mistakes we made. Admiral Stevens looked around the room at faces that showed genuine commitment to change. Very well. I'll be establishing a working group to develop new training protocols. You'll all be part of it. He turned back to Sarah. Commander Mitchell, your undercover mission is officially concluded. Admiral Torres will want a comprehensive report, but I suspect she'll be pleased with both the intelligence gathered and the impact achieved. What about the current crisis, sir? Your strategic assessment will be implemented. Initial reports suggest that your analysis of Iranian motivations was accurate, and your recommended approach may provide a path to peaceful resolution. As they prepared to leave, Lieutenant Commander Hayes approached Sarah. Commander, I owe you an apology. We all do. But more than that, I want to thank you for showing us how much better we can be when we abandon our assumptions. Major Kane, still struggling with the revelation but clearly committed to growth, extended his hand. I don't know if I would have had the courage to maintain cover for 3 months while being consistently underestimated. Your professionalism throughout this entire process has been remarkable." Sarah shook his hand, seeing in his eyes the kind of transformation that made difficult missions worthwhile. "The courage you're showing now, acknowledging mistakes, and committing to change is just as important." As they left Admiral Stevens' office, Sarah reflected on the unexpected turn her mission had taken. She had set out to document bias and discrimination, expecting to compile evidence for policy recommendations. Instead, she had participated in a real-time transformation of attitudes and behaviors that might prove more valuable than any formal report. The Persian Gulf crisis would be resolved through the kind of sophisticated strategic analysis that had been available all along, hidden beneath assumptions and prejudices. More importantly, a group of senior officers had gained direct experience with the cost of bias and the value of diverse perspectives. 3 weeks later, Admiral Torres reviewed Sarah's final report in her Pentagon office. The strategic assessment had indeed helped resolve the hostage crisis through diplomatic channels, preventing what could have become a significant military confrontation. But the secondary effects were proving even more valuable. "The Working Group on Analytical Bias has requested permanent status," Admiral Torres noted, "and enrollment in their training programs is exceeding capacity. The officers who participated in the revelation have become strong advocates for change," Sarah replied. "Sometimes experiencing bias firsthand is more powerful than any theoretical training." And the broader program changes? Admiral Stevens has implemented new evaluation protocols that focus on contribution quality rather than source assumptions. Initial results suggest significant improvements in collaborative effectiveness. Admiral Torres closed the report and looked at Sarah with satisfaction. "Mission accomplished, Commander, though I suspect the real impact is just beginning." As Sarah left the Pentagon, she thought about Jennifer Walsh, who had been selected for submarine command based on a new appreciation for her expertise. She thought about Major Kane, who was leading efforts to identify and develop overlooked talent throughout the Marine Corps. And she thought about the dozens of other officers whose careers might be positively affected by the systematic changes that were beginning to take root. Her secret mission was complete, but its effects would ripple through the Navy for years to come. Sometimes the most powerful revelations aren't about exposing weaknesses, but about discovering strength that was hidden in plain sight. The transformation was only beginning, but it was real, measurable, and lasting. And it had started with a simple truth. Expertise comes in many forms, and assumptions can blind us to the talent that surrounds us every day. Sarah had proven that sometimes the most effective way to change a system is to experience it firsthand, to endure its limitations, and then to reveal the cost of those limitations in ways that make change not just possible, but inevitable. The underestimation was over. The real work of building a better Navy was just beginning.